Welcome to the first episode of Casual Conversations. The idea is to talk to various people of in various walks of life and to get information and as much insights from them as possible. Today we'll be talking about litigation in IBC, and I'm fortunate enough to have two people who specifically deals in the subject matter of IBC, Miss Surbi and Miss Saloni from Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, Mumbai. So thank you all for joining us. Without, I would like to start with the first question itself. Yeah. Uh, I want Sobhidi to respond first and then followed by Saloni. The question is that how has life in litigation of IBC been to you? I want you to start over with how your journey started, then the process thereof, and your reflections upon it now that you look back. Over to Surbidi.
Thank you, Alokik, for having us today. To talk about my journey in IBC litigation as such, I was working as a derivatives lawyer in Juris Corp. There we used to deal with a lot of aspects pertaining to insolvency and restructuring. From there, the entire thing started in 2016. At that time, insolvency was not in picture. And in 2016, when IBC came into picture, at that time I had the opportunity to look into the various issues that might crop up and analyze them. And it was a very interesting subject. So from there, I applied to CAM, and thankfully I got into it because it's one of the, we can say it's one of the protagonists in the entire industry on IBC matters. After that, we've had an opportunity to deal with a lot of issues starting from the admission of an insolvency application. Effectively, we have evolved along with the law. As in 2016 to 2020, it's been a very wonderful and fruitful journey, I would say. And yeah, it's been a wonderful experience.
So I started with IBC work in, I think, June of 2017. By then, the code was already in effect for almost 7 months. Litigation in IBC initially, there was not that much litigation, which is why the matters were being heard quickly. The resolution was much faster. Now that there are so many matters, we see that there is a lot of time lag. Unfortunately, the courts are extremely burdened. So we don't see that much resolution as quickly as we did in the initial few stages. IBC as a law has evolved, I think, leaps and bounds in the past 3.5 years. For something as simple as initially, it was thought that all the admission had to be done within 14 days for Section 7, Section 9s, or Section 10s. But then that became directory and not a mandatory provision, which is why sometimes now we see that it takes over a few months for admission as opposed to the initial 14 days. We've seen the law evolve a lot, like Surbi said, like it's been a great journey. We've seen it grow from 0 precedents to now we have laws in almost every aspect of IBC. The code has had a great impact. From what I understand from the RBI trends and all, the NPAs of all the banks have come down. A lot of credit goes to the IBC. Litigation has evolved most definitely. Since initially there were no precedents, like I said, we were fortunate enough to be given this opportunity to be a part of, I wouldn't say framing the law, but definitely helping the courts interpret it.
All right. Thank you. That was a wonderful response indeed. The second question that I wanted to ask is for Saloni specifically. How is the litigation in IBC different in, say, let's say company matters when it comes to NCLT or DRT or matters of DRT? Please.
So as far as NCLT and other courts are concerned, like civil courts, I'm not talking about tribunals, it is vastly different because the NCLT has slightly more limited powers than civil courts. For example, something as simple as the NCLT doesn't have the power to record evidence. Not to say that it will not appreciate the documents put in front of it, but the power to record evidence, call witnesses for trial, that portion is not there. Of course, the idea behind this is faster resolution, quicker decisions. But it's a summary court, essentially. It will decide matters in a summary manner, which is not what a high court will do in a full-fledged trial or any other civil court. As far as other matters under the Companies Act are concerned, we've seen that, fortunately or unfortunately, because of the IBC coming into force, the company matters are taking a little bit of a backseat unless they involve some urgent interim reliefs. Now we see, especially the Bombay NCLT has the causes divided into two parts: priority matters and other matters. Now the priority matters are generally the IBC matters, which are for admission, and then the other matters will include IBC matters as well as company matters. So company matters have come quite down in terms of the priority. However, I think what the NCLT is doing is using this COVID time to dispose of as many scheme matters as they possibly can, and they're taking up those matters on a daily basis wherever they see some kind of urgency or where they can dispose of a matter faster. DRT and NCLT, I think that as far as the NCLT is concerned, considering the impact of the code, the NCLT is much faster in its resolution of matters as compared to DRT. Of course, now the personal insolvency is going to the DRT also. So we'll have to see how that develops. I don't think that there have been too many admissions there, to my mind. I don't know, so we can correct me if I'm wrong. So I feel like the NCLT resolution is faster than any other court. It has slowed down over the years, but even then it is faster than the other courts. You see quicker decisions.
Thank you. So I think that we need to start by basically responding on the question as to what are the various stages of litigation in NCLT firstly, because I think a lot of listeners here do not really know about the stages of litigation in of matters of IBC. So I would like you to quickly summarize the stages of litigation in IBC, starting from the procedure of filing itself in NCLT Mumbai.
Okay, sure. So basically, as far as the filing process is concerned, once an applications can be filed under Section 9, Section 7, and Section 10 of the IBC, depending on whether you're an operational creditor, financial creditor, or the company itself is filing. Once you file an application with the NCLT, generally speaking, within a week's time, the matter will come up on the board for the first time when the court will ask you to issue notice to the other side. After that, once the notice is issued to the other side, depending on the burden of the court and depending on the time that it has, matters will come up for hearing. The other side will be given an opportunity to respond. Now with the innovative judgments and a whole line of judgments, it is the NCLT has to hear the other side before passing even an order of admission under Section 7 for financial creditors as well. So after the hearing is complete, which generally nowadays typically would take between about 6 months, I would say, for an admission to take place. After the admission order is passed and IRP is appointed and the insolvency resolution starts, the NCLT can decide to reject an application also. There are various parameters depending on whether a financial creditor, operational creditor, or the company itself on which the NCLT can decide not to admit the application. After that, of course, you can go into appeal to the NCLAT and then to the Supreme Court. But if the admission is ordered and there is no appeal from that, the IRP is appointed and the process of insolvency resolution starts. The IRP will then call for the claims to be submitted. Once the claims from all the creditors are submitted, the IRP will verify those and they will form a committee of creditors comprising of the financial creditors of the debtor. I think that the remaining aspects will be better equipped to pick up from formation of the COC.
Thanks, Rumi. So basically, I wanted to add a couple of points. So at the pre-filing stage, when we are drafting, so the application under Section 7, 9, or 10, it is very essential to identify two things. Although there is a form prescribed under the CIRP regulations, but still you have to identify two things. One is debt, and secondly, default. So the form prescribes certain parameters which you need to fill in. For example, what is the amount of debt? How did the debt happen? How did the default happen? So to establish these two things, what you need to do is you need to have the documents identified. For example, if it's a financial creditor, it's very simpler because there you have loan documents which will establish debt. Then you will have to talk about default. For default, you will have to provide account statement, you have to provide banker's certificate, you have to provide if there is any demand notice or anything like that. So these things have to be provided at the pre-filing stage. Now taking forward from after the COC is constituted, at that stage, it's mostly what we see is inter-creditor disputes, if at all, that are emerging within the COC. In respect of, so two financial creditors will be fighting, let's say more than two financial creditors also, with respect to whether the claim of the other financial creditor is admissible or not. Now, to admit the claim or reject the claim is within the domain of resolution professional. There are catena of case laws which establish that a resolution professional is not an adjudicating authority. So there also we are seeing a lot of litigation whether the claim has been admitted rightly by the resolution professional. Like Saloni said, he has to verify the claim, but that does not mean he can act as a court to admit or reject the claim. He just has to admit the claim, basically what are the documents provided, and if it is a disputed claim, in that case he will admit it for a rupee value of 1, or he can we are seeing trends of claims being admitted at different levels also. We also see a lot of litigation on challenges by the operational creditors, although it has reduced substantially in light of the Supreme Court judgment in SR Steel, where it has been clearly laid down that the operational creditors are required to be paid a value which is the value under section 53 of which is the liquidation waterfall, or the value which would have been paid to them in case the resolution amount would have been paid as per section 53. So that criteria from operational creditors perspective has been clearly laid out. All right. Then just one second. We also see a lot of litigation coming up between the rival resolution applicants. That has also reduced substantially. But for example, what happens is the resolution professional, he would invite expression of interest where the resolution applicants would submit resolution plans. There will be a request for resolution plan that will be released, which will effectively lay down a broad criteria on the basis of which the plans have to be submitted. He will also release a virtual data room where he will upload all the documents and everything. Those resolution applicants will be submitting the plans. Now, various methods, or we can say mechanisms, can be adopted for evaluating the resolution plan. There's an evaluation matrix which is provided on the basis of which the plan will be evaluated. So that can be quantitative and qualitative. So let's say this plan, you and I both can submit a resolution plans, but the question is, do we have the requisite net worth? Do we have the relevant experience in the sector that we are submitting the resolution plan? If it's a telecom company, then do we have the requisite experience in the telecom industry or not? These are the kind of things that are looked into when the resolution plan is approved. So now, for example, plan can be submitted also in different manners. There can be an upfront payment, there can be a deferred payment, multiple plans can be submitted. So this is where the challenge between rival bidders come in. They can question the other bidders' plan that it is not maximizing the value of the corporate debtor. So these are the questions that we see. That is inter-resolution applicant challenges. These are other things. And then finally, we see challenges at the stage of approval of the resolution plan. We have seen challenges from different stakeholders, be it creditors, be it previous management, promoters, etc. So although the law, a lot of questions have been settled, still there is a lot of litigation ongoing that we can see effectively. So yeah.
So Alok, for you, like if we had to sum up the entire CIRP process in an extremely simplistic 8-step process, of course there is a lot of intricacies involved, but simplistically for everyone who doesn't know the process, the first step would be filing of the CIRP application. The second step would be acceptance or rejection of the application by the NCLT. The third step would be appointment of the IRP by the NCLT, which generally happens with the order of acceptance. The next step, the fourth step, would be constitution of the COC by the IRP. The fifth step would be appointment of the RP by the COC and then approved by the NCLT. Sixth step would be preparation of the resolution plan, which will then the seventh step is acceptance of the resolution plan by the COC, which resolution plan is then placed by the RP before the NCLT for approval. So these are the 8 steps of the CIRP process. Then the NCLT has the discretion whether to approve the resolution plan if it meets the criteria under the code, or then it can reject the resolution plan. In various stages, in every single stage, almost we see a lot of litigation. It has reduced as the precedents have come in, but even now, I think the maximum litigation is after the COC has been constituted and during approval of the resolution plan.
All right. Thank you very much for the responses that you gave, and it was indeed enlightening for almost all the listeners. The next question is specifically for Saloni ma'am. So how does NCLT view the matters that comes before it? So for example, there are two types of matters that comes before NCLT. One is of IBC and the other is of company matters, of course, under the Companies Act. So how does the role of NCLT change between both the matters, and what are the pointers that the lawyers and the judges must be aware of while dealing with both these separate matters?
So as far as the NCLT is concerned, it is a tribunal for matters under the Companies Act, and it is an adjudicating authority for matters under the code. As far as the matters under the code are concerned, I think the NCLT is trying to take an extremely pragmatic view of things. Lawyers need to assist the NCLT. We have to appreciate that the NCLT does not have enough time and it has way too many matters. The burden on the NCLT is very high. So it is our job as lawyers to make sure that we prepare submissions, prepare our arguments in a way that it is easy for the judges to be able to decide the matter, whether it is by a way of written submissions, whether it is by way of oral arguments. We have to make sure that we take as little time of the court as possible and give them as much material to write and to decide the matter. We've seen that the burden on the NCLT, they end up taking up almost over, I think, Surbhi, about 100 cases a day sometimes. So they do not have the bandwidth to listen to every matter like you would argue it in the High Court. They will give you as much time as they possibly can. So as lawyers, it is our job to make it concise. As far as matters under whether they're treating matters under the code and under the Companies Act at par, no, like I said, they are definitely trying to give more importance and prominence to matters under the code. Having said that, it's not like they are ignoring matters under the Companies Act. Wherever there is need for urgent hearing, wherever there is a need for some kind of urgent relief, the NCLT takes up those matters also on priority. They're trying to fix times to ensure that all matters are heard and that no litigant suffers. I think that because the law is still developing, the NCLT tends to take a more pragmatic view of things as opposed to a precedent-based view. The Supreme Court's also laying down the law which is binding all the NCLTs, which is making adjudication by the NCLTs much faster than it was initially when the NCLT was framing the law itself. So I think that as far as like I said, they are doing a fantastic job. They're trying to dispose of as many matters as they possibly can. Companies Act, unfortunately, has taken a slight backseat as far as the NCLT is concerned because the matters under the code are taking precedence.
Thank you, Saloni, for the response. The next question is specifically to Surbhi. Can you please tell us about the approach of courts and lawyers at the stage of approval of the resolution plan and the challenges that come post after it?
So, thank you. So, the approach we can divide parts. At the stage of approval of the resolution plan, we have seen a change in behavior of the NCLTs as to how they are dealing with it. Now, I would say for resolution plans, like I said earlier, there are different structures which are proposed in the resolution plan. It can be an upfront payment, it can be a deferred payment, and plus a resolution applicant has to provide the mandatory contents which are given in the IBC and the regulations. So the mandatory contents I will briefly cover like in 1 or 2 minutes are payment to the operational creditors, which I said earlier, it has to be as per the waterfall or the resolution amount being distributed as per the waterfall. Then payment to dissenting financial creditors being paid in priority to the financial creditors who vote in favor of the resolution plan. Then there has to be a payment of CIP cost in priority to any other payment to any other creditors. The resolution plan must be in compliance with the applicable law. So these are the certain very basic criteria which are laid down in the code and the regulations. Now, when a plan is put forward before the NCLT, earlier what used to happen is, like we've seen in one of the bigger matters, like there are some 50 applications listed on every day. Okay, so there will be a lot of challenges, and they used to hear all the applicants before they finally approve the plan. The drawback of this approach was there was erosion of value because of these multiple challenges, the plan would have been approved by in a year's time, which will be resulting into erosion of value of the assets. In any case, the particular company is being managed by a resolution professional who is an outsider. Now that outsider cannot make major decision because the plan has already been approved, and till the time NCLT approval is granted, he cannot take very major decisions, which again will not result into the development of the business, which should effectively happen, because it should come out of the insolvency as soon as possible. The more time is wasted, the more there is erosion in value of the assets. So this approach, we have seen a major shift in the approach of the NCLTs now, because the Supreme Court in multiple cases have laid down that the commercial decision making power is vested with the COC. So the Committee of Creditors has to make this decision whether a particular plan should be approved or not. What NCLT has to see is they only have to look into the mandatory contents of the resolution plan, whether they have been complied with or not, including compliance with the applicable law. So now NCLTs are reluctant to hear each and every challenge, and most of the, in fact, in one or two cases, we have seen them like the challenges being dismissed, like in the first hearing itself, and they deal with the limited contents that they have to look into, and they don't go into the principles of equity and all of that. Secondly, we have seen a, at the time of the approach of lawyers, when I say that also has been very substantially, it has evolved. Now they go into the nitty-gritties of the law itself rather than connecting it with SICA or other previous existing laws. What we see these days is they try to highlight gain experience from the other international laws, how there has been evolution of law in United Kingdom. From there we try to take guidance. We also try to take guidance from ancestral model law, which should have happened. The Because of all of this that has happened, there is a drastic evolution in the law itself, which is beneficial for the economy as a whole. At the time of implementation of the resolution plan, sorry, I wanted to cover one more point. In plans, there are generally a chapter on reliefs and waivers. You will ask, initially when the resolution applicants used to submit plans, they were like, we don't know what the company is holding, so we will submit some reliefs and waivers. There should be no tax penalty, there should be nothing. All the approvals, so for example, a mining approval should continue for perpetuity. Things like that used to be there. What now NCLTs have done is like, NCLT cannot grant these kind of reliefs. These reliefs should be obtained from the specific authority which has granted the approval. So tomorrow you cannot say that this approval should continue in perpetuity. These kind of things is not within the jurisdiction of the NCLT. So that change in approach has also happened. At the time of implementation of the resolution plan, a lot of implementations have not happened. A very limited resolution plans have been approved and implemented both. So one approach that has changed is effectively the COCs, and it has also been included in the CRP regulations. COCs have started to take performance guarantee. You cannot not implement the resolution plan these days. There is obviously there's a harm of the goodwill of the company who has failed to implement the resolution plan, but the performance security will also be forfeited. So these challenges will be there. But if you decide to proceed with implementation of the resolution plan, so effectively there is no going back. Once I've submitted my plan, that's about it. There's no going back. At the time of implementation, I will have to again seek a lot of approvals. Now the law in that aspect is still evolving, because let's say example of this COVID-19 situation only. We have plans which have been approved by the NCLT also, but there are approvals which have to be obtained. I can say in my plan that the management will be suspended, but I will appoint new directors. But given that the MCA is itself not working, there is no possibility of me appointing any management on the board or anything like that, which is a challenge. Now, because I cannot be questioned for not implementing the resolution plan because my hands are tied, but at the same time, these challenges cannot be ignored in entirety. So I would say, I think it's at the stage of implementation, the law is still evolving. We need a lot more clarity than what we have. I would give another example for example, in case of delisting of shares, SEBI has given certain exemptions, but they are not taking it very lightly. They don't allow delisting just like that. You need to take approvals. At implementation stage, it again is a very much challenging task. You need to, like, if it is not forthcoming, then I can be questioned for non-implementation of the resolution plan. So these are the multiple things which we still need to, there has to be an interplay of different regulators and all. But yeah, law at that stage is still evolving. That's about it.
Thank you, Surbidi, for the response. The next question, and probably the last question, is in relation to the unusual times that we are living in and its impact on IBC. So, COVID-19 vis-a-vis IBC. So, what all proposed? Can you please summarize as to the proposed amendments or the novel legislations that have come place in relation to litigation in IBC vis-a-vis COVID-19, and what are your reflections on it? We'll start with Saloni first.
Sure. So presently, the NCLTs are hearing only matters that are extremely urgent, and they're hearing the NCLTs are hearing some compromise scheme matters. The NCLT has clearly said that expiry of time is not going to be considered as an urgent matter. Because of this, they unfortunately, unless there is absolute urgency, people are not able to file applications. There is no hearing being given. This is leading to a lot of delay. Like Survi had highlighted, this kind of delay is going to impact a lot of resolution plans, because a lot of the companies' goodwill, their reserves are getting depleted. So the resolution applicants are suffering. The value attached to a company is reducing drastically, which is why the resolution applicants may or may not want to go ahead with their plans. Of course, we are looking at it was mentioned that they are going to suspend fresh filings of IBC, which is they will not be permitting filing of Section 7, Section 9, or Section 10 for a period of 6 months or until further orders. That is, they are planning to amend the IBC to introduce a Section 10A for suspension of any new filings. This is going to impact a lot of companies. We need to see whether this suspension is only for fresh debts or it includes even the debts which were prior in time before COVID hit. If they are including debts which are post-COVID, that would obviously give the company breathing space of 6 months to maybe repay their debts. There may be some other measures in the pipeline. From what we understand, they are framing an entire economic policy on this. But these are just news reports. Until the law is actually enacted or we receive such a policy, we wouldn't be able to say too much about that. But in terms of the filings, they have reduced. In terms of oral hearings, we're not getting too many. We have to file written submissions. You have to highlight the urgency. The NCLT is proactively taking up matters which it thinks are urgent, but it has definitely impacted the life of the lawyers drastically, because the work has maybe come down in terms of appearances, and it's gone more to opinions as opposed to actually appearing in court.
Surbidi, your take on it, some of your reflections on it?
Yeah, I just wanted to add some points. So one of the important things that has happened is that the threshold for filing the CIP application has increased from 1 lakh to 1 crore. Now we don't know whether it is going to continue or not, but as of now, that is the law. So the number of filings will reduce substantially, I would say, because most of the operational credit applications are like within the bracket of 10 to 20 lakhs, 25 lakhs. So that might decline because of this. Secondly, because of this, there has, like Saloni has pointed out already, like there will be challenges with respect to the implementation of the resolution plan and the fresh filings that might be taken up. On that, we although we have not seen the ordinance, but I don't know we don't have the fine print of the ordinance as well, but uh, I would say that it should be read in conjunction with the RBI circular, because the RBI has, by its various circular, given moratorium period with respect to payment of the loans, the term loans, and the working capital facilities that have been given. In light of that, if a suspension of IBC applications happens, then in that case, that would be fruitful. This has also happened in other jurisdictions like Australia, where suspension of filing of fresh applications for insolvency has been done. That is effectively going to help the economy, because the moment we are out of it, the delay of 50 days, there will be substantial changes in the economy, and we will be looking at a great depression, I think, after 1920 or something. But yeah, we definitely need to consider suspension of the fresh filing of the application for a while, and instead the focus should be more on restructuring of the accounts. uh, that is out of court restructuring that I'm referring to, where you can definitely propose the resolution plan and the banks can try to do that. Otherwise, it will be very harsh on the economy, because the moment an insolvency application is filed, the promoter is out of the picture, and Indian economy is not very well acquainted with that kind of a facet as of now. And yeah, that's my take on this.
All right. So, thank you all for joining in. First of all, thank you both of you for joining in. Just some last concluding remarks for people who want to enter into the field of litigation of IBC. Some words of advice, or quick tips for people who really are interested in litigation in IBC. We'll start with Saloni first.
So, if you ask me my personal opinion, I love this field of practice. It is very niche, and the law is developing every single day, but it is also very new. So anybody who wants to join this has to make sure that they're very well aware of at least all the landmark decisions, because there are not too many. There are quite a few, but there are not too many. Make sure that you're aware of the law, because considering that it's a new law, just knowing the code is not enough. The code has been interpreted in so many ways now that just even if you know the code cover to cover with the regulations, you would still not know the entire law of IBC. The NCLTs are a great forum to appear before. I think Surbhi will agree. They are quite forgiving. Also, at the same time, they give you the confidence. I think every judge that we've appeared before gives you the confidence to appear even though you may not be a senior advocate or even senior in the field. It's a great practice area which gives you exposure to almost all other laws, because IBC is not a standalone law. You have to read it in conjunction with everything, including tax laws, including Contract Act. So it's a great forum. It's a great law to be a part of. I would say if this is your area of interest, please go for it, because it's once you are in it, then you can be the master of it, and which is not something which you can do in normal commercial litigation, because it is so vast. So I would say that if IBC is where you want to be, then start today. Start going to courts. Start going to the NCLT, and if not to appear, just to watch. The law is developing every single day. So yeah.
Your takes on it, yeah.
Yeah. So I effectively don't do any other litigation matter, but I would definitely say I love doing IBC. It has taught me so much. And like Saloni said, it's not only about one law. We deal with a lot of other laws. Like me and Saloni have worked on so many matters, right from admission till the time of approval of the plans. We have seen matters where we are talking about labor law in one matter. In the other matter, we would be linking it with taxation laws. We'll be linking with some other law in the third matter entirely. So it's a very fun, see, learning and everything is there, but it's also very much fun, because you are evolving with the law. So new students who are reading it, they should definitely read it because they will be reading it in conjecture with the other laws that have developed. I have also advised on matters which involves arbitration questions, which involves other things. So I would definitely recommend you should effectively, like you should have a look at the entire law, how it is evolving. You should definitely go to the courts once to see how it is being argued, what is the different perspective. It's very important to just go and observe in the courtroom once in a while and just see that, how the judges are interpreting it, how the lawyers are arguing it, and the judgment will be something else altogether. So it's very fun. So yeah, I would recommend lawyers to go with
Yeah,
that.
I agree with Surbi. It's one of the best things about it is not knowing what to expect. Like you do.
I think that is certainly true for litigation in any sense.
Absolutely.
All right. So thank you so much for sparing the time and joining us today. Thank you for getting this time out of your busy schedule, because I know your lifestyles and your schedules completely. It's very difficult to even spare 1 hour of time. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. This was great.
Thank you,
Thank
Alok. It was really interesting.